Trump says America is a war zone that only he can fix with military force. But judges, including his own nominees, are calling his bluff with receipts. I want to start with a question that matters to all of us. What happens when a president claims your city is burning, your streets are overrun, and only he can save you by deploying troops? But it's not true? Hold that thought, because we're about to walk through something extraordinary. For a decade now, Donald Trump has painted America as a violent hellscape. He's used that story to justify extraordinary power grabs, deploying the National Guard to American cities, invoking century-old wartime laws, and threatening crackdowns on political opponents. But here's the twist. Judges are now fact-checking him in real time. And they're not buying it. In just the past few weeks, federal judges, including Trump's own nominees, have ruled against his troop deployments to Chicago, Oregon, and Los Angeles. They've rejected his claims of invasion at the border. And they've done it with language so sharp, it's hard to ignore. One judge said Trump's characterization of events was simply untethered to the facts. Another called the government's evidence simply unreliable and lacking credibility. These aren't activists in robes. These are judges doing their job, requiring proof before a president can send troops into American streets. So, what's really happening here? And what does it mean for your rights, your city, and the checks on presidential power? Let me walk you through the receipts. Let's start in Chicago. Trump has compared the city to a war zone. He posted a meme parodying Apocalypse Now, helicopters flying over a burning skyline, Trump superimposed like he's landing in Vietnam. His administration defended the National Guard deployment by claiming local police couldn't handle the situation and that there was a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. That language comes straight from federal law. It's one of the few circumstances that allows a president to federalize the National Guard. But on Thursday, U.S. District Judge April Perry shut that down. She said there was no rebellion, no danger of one. In fact, she said the deployment itself could fuel civil unrest. What were the actual facts on the ground? According to Judge Perry, protests at an Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility drew about 200 people. There were roughly 100 state and local law enforcement officers there to handle it. The judge said the Department of Homeland Security's version of events was simply unreliable and suffered from a lack of credibility. She noted the government's evidence was contradicted by local and state law enforcement, the people actually on the scene. At one point in the hearing, according to WTTW-TV, Judge Perry asked, "What if the president is relying on invalid evidence?" That's the question, isn't it? Now, Judge Perry was nominated by Joe Biden, so you might think this is just partisan pushback. But then we get to Oregon, and that's where things get really interesting. U.S. District Judge Karin Immergut is a Trump nominee, and she went even further. Trump has said he needs to save war-ravaged Portland from Antifa and other domestic terrorists. As recently as Friday, he called Portland almost an insurrection. Judge Immergut's lengthy ruling over the weekend dismantled that claim piece by piece. She acknowledged some significant violence near an ICE facility over the summer, but she said local authorities contained it. And by the time Trump issued his order on September 27th, protests typically involved 20 or fewer people. Then she added this line, "The protests have been such a minor issue that the normal nightlife in downtown Portland has required more police resources than the ICE facility." Read that again. Downtown Friday night, crowds need more cops than the so-called insurrection. Judge Immergut was careful to say courts should generally defer to a president's characterization of events, but she said Trump's version was just too far from reality. She wrote, "But A great level of deference is not equivalent to ignoring the facts on the ground. The president's determination was simply untethered to the facts. Untethered to the facts. That's a Trump-nominated judge writing about a Trump deployment. And it's not just these two cities. Let's talk about Los Angeles. Trump claimed the city was under siege until we got there. He suggested it was on the verge of going up in flames. Last month, U.S. District Judge Charles Breyer said, "No, that's not what happened." Breyer acknowledged protests and some violence, but he said there was no rebellion and civilian law enforcement was perfectly capable of responding. He compared the level of violence to Black Lives Matter protests and sometimes riotous parties after the Dodgers or Lakers won championships. Then he drew a historical contrast. He said the protests were far more similar to these events than they were to the 1894 Pullman strike, which crippled interstate commerce across the western United States, the kind of crisis that actually justified calling in the military back in the 19th century. So, we've got 3 cities, 3 judges, 3 rejections of Trump's war zone narrative. But it doesn't stop there. Let's talk about the border. Trump has repeatedly claimed we're facing an invasion of migrants. He's used that word both on the campaign trail and in court to justify invoking the Alien Enemies Act, a law that requires an invasion or predatory incursion if it's used outside wartime. Trump specifically claimed we were being invaded by Venezuela via the gang Tren de Aragua and used that as justification to rapidly deport migrants. Even Republican-nominated judges said no. U.S. Appellate Judge Leslie Southwick, a George W. Bush nominee, wrote in an opinion last month, "A country's encouraging its residents and citizens to enter this country illegally is not the modern-day equivalent of sending an armed, organized force to occupy, to disrupt, or to otherwise harm the United States. There is no finding that this mass immigration was an armed, organized force or forces." And in May, Trump-nominated U.S. District Judge Fernando Rodriguez Jr. ruled against Trump's use of the Alien Enemies Act. Rodriguez wrote, "As for the activities of the Venezuelan-directed TDA in the United States, and as described in the proclamation, the court concludes that they do not fall within the plain ordinary meaning of invasion or predatory incursion for purposes of the AEA. No invasion, no rebellion, nothing local police can't handle. And most of these rulings came from Republican-appointed judges." Now, let me pause and address the obvious counterargument. Aren't there real problems in this country? Yes, absolutely. There were assassination attempts against Trump. There's been violence against Democratic leaders over the past year. The assassination of Charlie Kirk last month is a tragedy. Crime is a real issue in many large cities. I'm not pretending everything is fine. But here's the difference. Trump has painted a picture of historic, organized violence that requires wartime responses. Responses that happen to give him enormous power. The judges aren't saying there are 0 problems. They're saying the problems don't justify the extraordinary powers Trump is claiming. And that distinction matters for your life. Because when a president can deploy troops to American cities based on exaggerated claims, that changes the rules. It means federal forces can show up in your neighborhood not because there's an actual rebellion, but because the president says there is, even if local police, local mayors, and local evidence say otherwise. It means your city becomes a testing ground for expanding executive power, not a place being rescued from chaos. And if judges don't fact-check those claims, there's no limit to where troops can be sent or what laws can be invoked. That's why these rulings are so important. They're a bulwark, a check on power that says proof matters. So what happens next? Trump's legal team will almost certainly appeal these decisions. We'll see if higher courts uphold these rulings or defer more to presidential claims. Watch for 2 things. First, whether the administration provides new evidence in appeals. real data, not just rhetoric, or whether it doubles down on the same debunked claims. Second, watch whether Trump tries to deploy troops to other cities using similar language. If he does, and judges keep rejecting it, that's a pattern. It tells you the claims aren't holding up under scrutiny anywhere. Let me give you 3 quick predictions. First, more likely than not, Trump will continue using war zone rhetoric regardless of what judges say. It's been his brand for a decade, and it fires up his base. Second, I think we'll see at least one more major court fight over troop deployments before the end of the year. The pattern is set. Trump orders deployment. States sue. Judges demand proof. Administration struggles to provide it. Third, and this is speculation, so take it with caution, I wouldn't be surprised if we see legislation introduced to clarify the standards for invoking these emergency powers. Not because it'll pass, but because Democrats will want to make Republicans vote on whether a president needs real evidence before sending troops to American cities. Now, here's what you can do. You don't need to march or protest, but you can track this. Court filings are public. When Trump claims your city is a hellscape, check local crime stats. Check what your mayor and police chief are actually saying. Compare the president's words to the data on the ground. If your city gets a troop deployment, ask your representatives, what's the evidence? Demand they request the same documentation judges are demanding. And keep an eye on judicial nominees. These rulings show that judges, even Trump's own nominees, can be a meaningful check on power when they take their jobs seriously. That's not partisan. That's the system working. Remember that question I started with? What happens when a president claims your city is burning but it's not? Here's the answer. Judges can call it out. The system can push back, but only if we're paying attention and demanding that words match reality. The receipts are in. Trump's hellscape isn't holding up in court. Now let's talk. Which of these rulings surprises you most? And do you think higher courts will uphold them or overturn them? If this breakdown helped you see past the rhetoric and into the receipts, subscribe for more clear, fact-first analysis. I'll keep tracking the evidence so you don't have to guess.